To call any piece of media a perfect sequel is quite hard. Not much media out there tends to understand in full proportions what made the original great in the first place, and how to correctly expand upon the concepts related in the first part without entirely copying the tropes of that part. It's a common problem seen in movies, games, and books, where the original movie may be an absolute masterpiece deserving of praise from all. The sequel may entirely destroy the reputation, in part due to a lack of originality or an entire lack of understanding as to what made the original great in the first place. So it's quite the triumph when a sequel is able to expand upon the original, stay true to the roots of greatness that grew from the original, and somehow be better than the original in almost all of its aspects. Today we'll be talking about how Max Payne 2 achieves exactly this, a rare example of a perfect video game sequel. Before discussing the usual points such as the development of this game or the gameplay and narrative, we've got to understand what makes a sequel good in the first place. For video games, this question is a lot more jarring than it is for other media. For a movie, it all really depends on how a movie expands upon the original's narrative and world and accentuates it further. For a video game, a sequel must improve the gameplay, the narrative, the controls, and every other aspect which is entirely unique to the medium of video games in order to truly achieve a perfect sequel. In the gameplay department, a sequel has to use the previous game's mechanics and systems as a base or platform to further improve the existing mechanics in place and add entirely new ones to spice up the gameplay. If a sequel sticks to the original in every way, including its own gameplay, the non-experimental nature of the sequel will fall flat for not utilizing the means of new technology and ideas, which will generally result in a failed product. To improve upon an already existing gameplay framework, even one that is fantastic, is to be able to give more of the same, adding new mechanics in order to spice it up and then improving what already exists. Many video game sequels fail to do this. Red Dead Redemption 2 is an absolutely excellent game, but there's not many facets as for one to tell me it truly changed or innovated upon the original in terms of gameplay. It stuck bare bone to the original's mechanics and it struggled in the department of gameplay for this exact reason. A perfect example of a sequel that is able to expand on an already excellent gameplay system is that of Batman Arkham City. The game utilizes the sticks of Asylum, but it adds more and more sticks to the pile until it starts blazing. Almost everything from the original was perfected and improved upon. This included combos, flying, gadgets, and every other aspect you can think of. In terms of how to expand upon the narrative, that in itself is self-explanatory. Introducing new characters without dismembering the existence of old ones is a feature of a great sequel, but then there's also the case of developing existing characters to further characterize and develop them. Adding new themes not seen in the original while sticking to the roots of what made the original great in the first place is at the heart of a good sequel in terms of a narrative. Expanding the world, the places, and the characters is what makes a sequel actually good. Unlike the original Max Payne, the development of Max Payne 2 is a little bit more straightforward. However, there's a large factor within the development cycle, or more specifically just before it, that is important to point out. Take-Two Interactive acquired the Max Payne franchise from Remedy and 3D Realms for a slight $10 million in December 2001, only a few months after the original's release. Take-Two then announced incentives of up to $8 million to develop Max Payne 2. So this would now mean that Rockstar Games had taken up the reins to have a more secure place in the development of this game, more specifically being the sole publisher of Max Payne 2. Much of the staff that worked on the original, such as series creator Sam Lake himself, returned to write the plot and had a much more nuanced approach to writing it this time around. He described his new aspiration for the plot of Max Payne 2 to reflect that of a film noir love story, as he thought that would be the best direction for Max Payne's character after the events of the original game. Much of the development of the game stayed the same, but it doesn't seem that as much details were released for this game in comparison to Max Payne's first outing. The screenplay that was written for the game's narrative ended up being significantly larger than the original by over 3 times, creating a narrative that would end up being much more complex than the original. The game does utilize the same engine as Max Payne 1, but with a few significant upgrades in terms of graphical and technical fidelity. The polygon count has now been increased, which makes the characters' textures a lot more smoother than their roughened nature in the original. They have greater facial expressions, and a new physics engine was designed to allow for certain actions that weren't possible in the original with limited technological advances. For example, boxes could be moved and followed the laws of gravitation, as well as explosions making enemies fall more gracefully than their ragdoll nature in the original game. These might sound simple now, but at the time, this was a development in games unlike any other, and it would help push the industry forward in terms of a technical and graphical perspective. A few improvements would also be introduced to the bullet time ability, as well as sounds of certain weapons, projectiles, and explosions sounding more realistic. The game would release on the 14th of October in 2003 to much critical acclaim, as the focus of the praise centered around the refined and incredible gameplay, as well as the more focused story that wasn't as prevalent in the original. The major criticism for the game would end up being its length, which was hours shorter than the original on average, which even fans of the franchise have spoken upon. In terms of a gameplay standpoint, Max Payne 2 isn't significantly indifferent to that of the original, other than the introduction of a few major upgrades to the gameplay system and mechanics that were already in place. As mentioned before, a video game sequel must strive not to specifically create an entire new gameplay system or create something of revolutionary substance. Instead, the game must improve and innovate upon the systems already in place. Max Payne 2 has done exactly that, as it didn't stray far from what made the original's gameplay innovative in the first place, and stuck with the mindset more of the same in terms of gameplay, while still taking strides to improve the problems occurring with the original's gameplay mechanics. The gameplay pretty much revolves around the combat scenarios and a few platforming sections, much like the first game, but the sections of gameplay which aren't exclusive to combat aren't exactly anything to write home about. The weapon variety, which needed some more diversity than the original, is definitely improved upon, with a new batch of assault rifles and SMGs that help mix up combat scenarios, especially in this game, as the number of enemies per encounter seems to be much higher than the original. In the original, enemies would only fight you in smaller groups, while here they fight all together, firing from all directions, which makes the ability of bullet time that much more significant and vital to how you must survive. The AI, however, stays relatively the same in terms of their scripted nature, but it did seem to me that in this game they were a lot more aggressive, barging into rooms, throwing grenades at a greater pace, etc. They make the combat scenarios a little more intense. However, the enemies still aren't smart enough to really put up a fight unless they are in larger numbers. The levels again are quite linear, but as mentioned in my retrospective of the original, the levels do seem quite open-ended, and there's a few different pathways in terms of interactivity with the environment around you. This can again make navigation a little confusing, as there's not many ways to tell whether the path you're taking is going to be the right one, other than the cues that Max has for the player in terms of internal monologue, as he speaks on what he needs to do next. The combat itself has been improved a little bit, as the maneuvering and bullet time and how the ability is utilized has been improved upon. Jumping and utilizing the ability will not deplete the meter, making this a risky yet effective way to take down groups of enemies when jumping from a vantage point. This creates some of the most creative kills that the game can muster up, as at certain times you will find that jumping off a stairwell or a higher floor and activating bullet time in that scenario produces a highly engaging way of taking down foes. Other than that, the only other improvement in terms of a gameplay perspective is one that is extremely simplistic but was definitely needed, which is being able to utilize projectiles such as grenades or Molotov cocktails without having to disarm yourself like in the original. There's also AI companions in different levels of the game, but they don't do much to support you, and they end up dying fairly quickly without having any effect on the story or the gameplay as a whole. Now we'll quickly discuss how in some sections of the game the player may control Mona Sachs. Mona doesn't play too differently to Max, but playing as her from a story perspective lets us see the encounter and scenarios the pair get up to in varying perspectives. What Mona did have was a bit more mobility in terms of flipping backwards and doing tricks while in combat scenarios that made her a little different to Max in terms of how you'd approach each scenario. She's a lot more versatile in terms of a combat perspective, and I felt that I could be more aggressive playing as her than Max. She also wields a pair of Desert Eagles, which as Max is extremely difficult to pull off due to limited ammo, but for Mona she's always wielding them and a sniper rifle. Although she isn't drastically different to Max in terms of a gameplay perspective, I believe seeing the game in a different perspective in terms of a combat and gameplay perspective does help mix it up and diversify the scenarios a little more, where they could become a little dry due to the sheer frequency of them. To end off, there's also a final boss fight at the end of the game, if you could really call it that, against Vladimir Lem. It's not a very enticing boss fight and just involves dodging an infinite amount of grenades that he throws down from a vantage point, while you have to dodge and shoot the anchors that hold up the platform that he stands on. With this, he succumbs to his death, and so this isn't very interesting and a disappointing way to end the game off in terms of its gameplay, despite the game's ability to muster up something creative with its unique bullet time mechanic. One of mine and other critics' major points of contention with the original was the narrative that was entirely lackluster compared to the innovative gameplay. It definitely wasn't bad, but as I mentioned in my retrospective of the original, it's quite predictable and isn't anything entirely original, despite the ability to make it so. So when I spoke earlier about being a perfect sequel in terms of a narrative, the game had to improve and develop the characters featured further, introduce new ones potentially, and expand upon the themes presented in the original. You can already guess that the complexity and storytelling and the capability of Remedy to develop Max into a tragic love story is something entirely remarkable by 2003 standards. Developing Max further, his motives, and the plot entirely is what makes this game a perfect sequel in terms of a storytelling onlook. To begin the discussion of the game's plot, I'll first lay down a story synopsis to get myself and everyone else back to speed to further discuss my thoughts on the narrative and its characters. The story again starts from Max being in a scenario that the player has no idea about, where Max narrates his ventures to get to that point, recalling the events of the last few days. This is what the player will play through as they go through all the different narrated scenarios Max goes through in order to get to the starting cutscene, which is also coincidentally the end of the narrative as well. Max Payne has now been acquitted of the charges that were laid against him at the end of the first game, and is again reinstated in his old job as a detective for the NYPD. While investigating a gunfight at a warehouse owned by his prior ally in the first game, Russian mobster Vladimir Lem, Max encounters a group of hitmen who are trying to kill him, known purely as the Cleaners. These Cleaners have raided the warehouse for the weapons within, which Max is trying to identify why. During this entire operation, Max runs into contract killer Mona Sachs, who he previously thought had died 2 years ago. The game then returns to a previous hospital scene, where Max works his way to eliminate the Cleaners that are trying to assassinate him, and is able to escape the building. While this is going on, Max is curious as to what really happened with Mona Sachs, who previously escapes from the warehouse without any clues for Max to follow her. While tracking her down within the inner circle, that's when he finally discovers that the target of the Cleaners is purely on him and Mona Sachs, who is a suspect for the murder of a senator and is currently being pursued by other police forces within New York. Max decides to visit Senator Alfred Woden, who is the leader of the inner circle and is the one that was able to remove any traces of Max's involvement with the events of the first game. Woden reveals to Max that Vlad is also a member of the inner circle, who is focused on getting rid of Woden and is the one that hired the Cleaners in the first place to take over Woden's position and take over the inner circle, which would definitely give him control over the criminal underbelly of New York. Max manages to save another mobster at threat of death due to Vlad's men, and the two head to Mona's hideout for assistance. However, Vlad is able to ambush both of them as he kills Vinny, the other mobster, and heavily injures Max before revealing that Mona is working for Woden. Mona betrays Max and attempts to follow her order to eliminate him, but finds herself unable to do so due to her feelings. They end the game by both of them kissing before she's shot to death, as Max then fights Vlad while Woden's mansion burns around them, until Max finally achieves the killing blow. As you can probably tell just by the game's synopsis for its narrative, the story here is a lot more complex and entrenched in realism than that of the original game. It focuses on themes of betrayal and forbidden love, one that cannot flourish due to the circumstances at hand. Max and Mona are in love, but the fact they both fight for completely different motives divides them, and they are not able to see the light on certain situation. Max tries to pursue this love, but Mona isn't as interested in the love at most points in the game until the very end, when she also prioritizes this forbidden love above all else. The narrative focuses on Max's trauma and how it leads into other facets of his life. He cannot escape the initial trauma of his wife and child's death, and as a result, he fumbles in every other venture he embarks on. This theme is also carried on to the third game, which I'll discuss in a separate video, but the narrative of this game is excellent. The complexity takes a higher tolerance compared to the first, and the game truly is able to form a narrative that is full of themes and characters that feel alive. To make the characters in the world feel alive in 2003 was quite a daunting task, and the fact that Remedy was able to do so really displays the sheer talent and quality of the team that was working relentlessly in order to build the game. The first game's narrative suffers a lot from its predictability and the fact that it isn't complex in any way. The sequel, on the other hand, is able to see what worked in terms of a character and theme perspective in the first game, and is able to carry that over in order to build a narrative that would have a much greater impact on the audience. And I can say that with confidence, the narrative of Max Payne 2 is simply brilliant. Well, that's it then. My second retrospective on the Max Payne series and an analysis of the second game in the series. I'll be discussing the third game in depth in about a week as well, so anticipate that if you're interested in this series so far. If you haven't already, check out my retrospective on the original to see further insight into my analysis of these games. Now, I'll quickly discuss what videos are going to be next in the schedule. There will be a Yakuza series video, which the thumbnail will be on screen now. This is a concept I'd like to try for other video game series, so please check out the video if you are interested. Next on the roster will hopefully be a Force Unleashed retrospective, and then with that will come the Max Payne 3 retrospective. I hope you've all enjoyed the video up to this point, and I thank you for getting in this far. Anyway, that's all from me for today's video. I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.